I was leaning against the threshold of the brownstone's front hall, polishing my ever-present skepticism along with my shoes, when the day's first disruption arrived. The doorbell had rung in a way that suggested urgency, a staccato, impatient summons, rather than the leisurely chime reserved for our regulars. I glanced at Wolfe, who was reclining with the solemn grandeur of a sphinx in his chair, sipping coffee with his eyes half closed, as if he were already 5 deductions ahead of anyone daring to disturb him. "Another client?" I asked, with the dry curiosity of someone who's learned that client is rarely a synonym for boring errand. Wolfe didn't answer. He never did. Not unless the matter was pressing enough to pull him from contemplation, or unless, in some inscrutable way, it promised him entertainment or intellectual satisfaction. By the time I opened the door, a woman was standing there, holding herself as if she had just crossed a battlefield and survived not a physical one, but a social minefield. She was in her early 40s, dressed in muted greys, but there was something about the sharpness in her eyes that suggested steel beneath chiffon. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, not quite certain whether to direct her query at me or the imposing figure seated behind me. I introduced myself as Archie Goodwin, the man who does the field work. She gave a small nod, as though noting me for later, not a warm recognition, just the acknowledgement of a potential ally or obstacle. "I'm Eleanor Marrowbone," she said, "to need Mr. Wolfe's help." Her voice wavered, but there was a steely edge beneath it that hinted she'd been through situations demanding courage, calculation, or both. Wolfe's eyes opened, those pale, cold observatories, surveying everything in a single sweep. "State your case," he said. His tone was deliberately neutral, almost cruelly so, like a scalpel hovering before incision. Ms. Marrowbone took a breath. "It's a matter of family records, personal correspondence. Something has been taken or hidden, possibly both. I've reason to believe it's more than a domestic grievance. It could affect my late father's estate, his reputation, and even his colleagues. I need someone who can think without leaving a footprint." Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly. That was all it took for me to know we were being asked to step into the delicate territory of secrets and strategy, where footprints visible or imagined were everything. "I must warn you," Wolfe said, his voice dropping like a gavel striking a table, "I do not move without cause. I do not chase rumors. I do not intervene in matters of sentiment unless the intellect behind the request satisfies certain thresholds." She nodded quickly, almost eager to show she understood, though her fingers fidgeted at the strap of her handbag. "I can provide details, documentation, names, timelines. I only ask for discretion. And results." Wolfe leaned back, staring at her like he was weighing the mass of her soul with a scaleboard of logic. "And what precisely is it you wish to recover or uncover? Letters, notes, possibly a diary. Anything that speaks to the true circumstances surrounding my father's final years." There are ambiguities in the will, ambiguities in his professional conduct, and I have reason to suspect deliberate concealment. Wolfe didn't move. His lips were a thin line. His gaze, however, was like a dam about to burst, not with emotion, but with calculation. I could see the mental wheels turning: risk, reward, control, opportunity. Finally, he spoke. "I will consider your proposition. I will require full disclosure in writing of all facts at your disposal. I do not negotiate orally when precision is required." Ms. Marrowbone's relief was subtle but visible. "I can provide that immediately." She fumbled briefly with her handbag, producing a small, neat leather folder. The smell of ink and aged paper drifted toward us like a whisper from another time. I caught a glimpse of the contents: handwritten notes, envelopes sealed with wax, and a few typescripts. Nothing flashy, nothing overtly criminal. But Wolfe's interest was piqued. He didn't reach for it. He simply gestured at me. "You will catalogue these, and you, Miss Marrowbone, will wait here. We will determine whether this is a matter worthy of pursuit." As I took the folder, I noticed the faint tremor in her hands. Not fear, exactly more like a mixture of hope and apprehension. I knew the type. She'd come looking for guidance, and she was about to find a man who could see motives in shadows. Once she was seated, I whispered, "You think he'll take it?" Wolfe's response was an arch, measured exhale of coffee steam. He always does, Archie, when the intrigue outweighs the inconvenience. "This has promise, promise." That was a word loaded with more danger than optimism, and I knew instinctively that this promise wasn't about money or legal maneuvering. It was about strategy. Someone had hidden something or was hiding themselves. Someone had miscalculated. And Wolfe, for reasons I would soon discover, was ready to exploit it. I handed back the folder to him. "Well, if this is all about letters and diaries, I hope they at least have a good story. Otherwise it's going to be a long few weeks." Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me with that hint of disdain only he could master. Long, short, irrelevant. Duration is immaterial. The outcome is not. I shrugged. "Right. Just don't get so wrapped up in the moral implications that you forget to eat." He didn't answer, of course. He never did on that subject. But the tilt of his head, the imperceptible tightening around his eyes, told me enough the wheels were turning, and the brownstone was about to be disturbed in ways that would pull all of Usher's, mine and Wolfe, into something far more complex than a simple recovery of letters. Outside, the city went on in its indifferent chaos, unaware that a quiet war of intellect had begun. On West 35th Street, inside, the scent of coffee, paper, and quiet tension mingled. I sat back, feeling the first tug of curiosity in days, and wondered exactly how deep this Marrowbone secret would reach, and how many people would be caught in its shadow. It was late morning before the first ripple of actual disturbance reached the brownstone, though in truth the arrival of Eleanor Marrowbone had already disrupted the usual equilibrium. Wolfe had remained seated, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the room, as if evaluating whether the intrusion carried sufficient intellectual weight to merit his attention. I, on the other hand, had been pacing the rug, half annoyed, half amused, cataloguing the precise way in which her presence had shifted the usual patterns of our lives. The first true sign that the brownstone's usual calm was under siege came in the form of a visitor I was not expecting. Theodore Harrow, a lawyer with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to doors opening for him, arrived unannounced. He breezed into the office with a portfolio clutched under his arm, and an expression that suggested he believed every step he took to be right, and everyone he met to be fortunate. "Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Goodwin," he said, inclining his head in a polite bow that barely masked the calculated glint in his eye. "I hear there's a matter concerning the late Mr. Marrowbone's estate. I thought it prudent to introduce myself and ensure the interests of my clients are represented." Wolfe's eyes, which had been glancing toward the window, now fixed on Harrow like a predator evaluating prey. "State your business," Wolfe said, calm, precise, dismissive in tone. Harrow raised a thin, perfectly arched eyebrow. "Simply that I intend to verify that no actions are being taken that might compromise legal interests. My clients are concerned about missing documents, possibly correspondence, letters, contracts, anything that may affect claims on the estate. I'm here to observe and, if necessary, intercede." Wolfe inclined his head ever so slightly, the only acknowledgment he ever gave to threats or subtleties of intimidation. "You will observe nothing without my permission. The client's interests here are under my supervision, and no outside interference will be tolerated. Do you understand?" Harrow's composure did not falter. "Perfectly," he said. though the twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed his irritation. He lingered, as though expecting Wolfe to invite him further into the brownstone, but Wolfe simply returned to his chair and resumed his meditative posture, leaving Harrow at the threshold like a bird barred from the nest. That was the first lesson of the day in this house. Even a man with legal authority was a mere observer until Wolfe deemed otherwise. I suppressed a grin, noting silently that Eleanor Marrowbone's hopeful eyes were following Wolfe like a student awaiting approval from a particularly exacting teacher. By mid-afternoon, the tension had escalated with the arrival of a second outsider, Miranda Cross, an archivist and long-time associate of the Marrowbone family who claimed expertise in the collection and authentication of private papers. She moved quickly, almost nervously, yet with the precision of someone used to handling delicate material. She carried a small satchel that seemed disproportionately heavy for its size, and the scent of old paper and ink clung to her like a cloak. "I've been asked to assist in cataloguing and verifying the documents," she said, not bothering with formalities. She handed me a list of items she had been instructed to locate, then glanced at Wolfe, who made no motion, not even the slightest twitch. Her eyes narrowed briefly, and I could read the calculation behind the expression, trying to gauge the man who needed no introduction, whose intellect was as imposing as the marble staircase in the hall. As she began her work, arranging envelopes and sorting letters with meticulous care, I followed in the background, cataloguing observations, noting hesitations, glances exchanged, minor inconsistencies. That was my methodless, overt questioning, more about capturing the human flickers that betray motives and secrets. Meanwhile, Wolfe remained a sentinel in his chair, responding only when necessary. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the work being done, but his silence was a constant weight, an unspoken demand for correctness and honesty. Every action in the room felt measured against his presence. It was in this controlled chaos that a subtle tremor of disturbance revealed itself. One of the letters, a small, unassuming note written in faint ink, had vanished from the stack. Not taken blatantly, not dropped accidentally, simply gone. Miranda Cross looked around in mild confusion. Eleanor Marrowbone's hands trembled ever so slightly, and even Harrow, standing awkwardly near the door, exhibited the faintest flicker of irritation. Wolfe's gaze moved like a hawk. "Note missing," he said, his voice a low ripple across the room. "No surprise, no hysteria, just acknowledgement. You will locate it immediately, or its removal will have consequences." I darted around, checking under chairs, behind the desk, beneath the rug. Nothing. My annoyance rose. It wasn't often I was stumped by the brownstone itself, but subtlety in theft, if theft was something Wolfe relished. Miranda Cross's eyes widened as she realized what Wolfe had already known. "It's gone?" she asked, voice tight. Wolfe inclined his head. "Gone." Yet the manner of its disappearance indicates more than mere carelessness. Someone present understands the value of discretion. Eleanor Marrowbone made a small noise of alarm, clutching at her handbag, but that letter could be crucial. "I must have it." "Calm yourself," Wolfe said, and in his calm was a command that softened panic into reason. "The letter will be accounted for. We do not act recklessly. I will require the cooperation of all parties." "Present. Nothing leaves this room without my knowledge. That is a condition." Harrow shifted uneasily, and Miranda Cross stiffened. Even Eleanor, whose nerves had been taut all day, nodded. Wolfe's dominion was absolute. Anyone entering the brownstone quickly understood that. I sank into a chair, rubbing my forehead. The day had begun with polite introductions, escalated through the arrival of legal authority and a professional archivist, and now rested on the sharp edge of mystery, a missing document, tensions rising quietly but palpably, and the inevitable question of who among us had taken it or whether it had simply vanished into the cracks of human error and architectural cunning. From my vantage point, I could see the delicate dance of observation and calculation. Wolfe, the immovable observer, poised above it all. Me capturing the signals others missed. Eleanor Marrowbone, anxious but hopeful. Harrow, officious yet contained. Miranda Cross, professional and meticulous but not impervious. Each presence was a variable in a controlled experiment, and the experiment had just begun. Outside, the city carried on indifferent to the dramas of West 35th Street. Inside, the brownstone's air had thickened with expectation. Every tick of the clock was a silent drumbeat, counting down to discovery or deception. The smallest slip would be noted, the faintest hesitation would be remembered, and I knew, as I always knew when Wolfe's eyes were involved, that the next hours would be decisive, not by force or volume, but by intellect, timing, and precision. The first 2 days in the brownstone had already begun to feel like a carefully orchestrated ballet, except nobody was dancing, and everyone was under intense scrutiny. The disappearance of that single, inconspicuous letter had rattled the delicate balance of our small ensemble. Wolfe, seated like a marble sentinel, exuded the same unflinching calm while I moved through the room like a chronicler of human behavior, documenting every twitch, glance, and calculated pause. It was during the third morning that the circle of suspects became more defined. Eleanor Marrowbone, of course, remained present, her anxious energy now tempered with determination. She had insisted, almost desperately, that the recovery of these documents was not only about family legacy but about justice for her father. Her face, a combination of resolve and lingering worry, was a window into someone used to managing appearances, yet unpracticed in dealing with secrecy at this scale. Then came the arrivals who would complete the inner circle, each bringing with them subtle tensions and motives that only a few careful observations could detect. First was Reginald Carow, a distant cousin and an accountant with a penchant for numbers and a reputation for frugality bordering on paranoia. Carow's appearance carried the air of someone who had long suspected misdeeds and was now prepared to pounce on any opportunity. He shook hands with Wolfe, then cast a quick glance at me and the other parties, already evaluating assets and potential vulnerabilities. Next was Julian Sloane, a young lawyer newly appointed to manage Marrowbone estate matters. Sloane had ambition stitched into the way he walked, the tilt of his chin, and the impatient flicker of his eyes. He was polite, almost excessively so, but his charm was mechanical, a veneer over an analytical mind hungry for leverage. I took note of the subtle adjustments he made while handling papers, the way he sized up the room as if every surface might conceal secrets and every human a potential informant or obstacle. Finally, there was Margaret Hollis, a former secretary of Mr. Marrowbone, whose loyalty had apparently transferred fully to Eleanor, though not without evidence of subtle judgment. Her eyes, calculating and sharp, betrayed both protective instincts and a desire to maintain control over information. She had an intimate knowledge of the documents, their storage, and possibly the habits of those around her. Margaret's presence introduced a tension that was almost tangible loyalty colliding with personal stake, knowledge paired with discretion. The five of them, Eleanor, Carow, Sloane, Hollis, and the lingering spectre of the missing letter, formed a constellation of potential motives and hidden truths. Each had access, each had reason, and each had subtle personal stakes. Wolfe, as always, remained calm, absorbing every nuance. From where I sat observing his slight inclinations, I could see him mentally aligning motives, alibis, and personalities, constructing a mental lattice through which the smallest thread of evidence might later unravel. I took to moving among them, casual and invisible, asking questions that seemed offhand, but were designed to trigger subconscious reactions. "Miss Hollis," I began, glancing at her neatly arranged pile of papers, "did you notice anything missing yesterday?" Her hands froze briefly over the papers. "I thought a few envelopes had been misplaced, but nothing seemed taken," she said carefully, with that precise intonation someone uses to mask knowledge. "And Mr. Carrow?" I said. "Any unusual correspondence recently?" He adjusted his spectacles, eyes darting to Wolfe. "Unusual?" he repeated, voice clipped. "Perhaps. But nothing that would concern anyone outside the family circle." The slight hesitation on nothing was a flicker of self-consciousness. I filed away. Sloane, meanwhile, hovered near a window, scanning the street below with an eye that seemed simultaneously attentive and detached. "I prefer facts over speculation," he said finally. "If documents are missing, then evidence of the removal should exist. Otherwise, we deal with conjecture." His measured tone was meant to project authority, but it also suggested impatience with anything that did not advance his own agenda. Eleanor, fidgeting with the edge of her gloves, finally spoke. "All of you must understand I am not trying to blame anyone. I just want to know the truth. My father's work and his legacy depends on it." Her eyes swept the group, trying to convey sincerity, but the subtle self-interest behind her plea did not escape me. People often fail to recognize the personal filter they cannot hide, and Wolfe, I knew, would spot it instantly. The interactions were punctuated by silences, the kind of heavy, loaded pauses that carry more information than words ever could. Wolfe remained at the center, a calm observer whose presence alone enforced precision and restraint. Every look, every twitch, every subtle shift in posture was accounted for in the meticulous ledger of his mind. I noted that the smallest micro-expression, the almost imperceptible narrowing of Carrow's eyes, Sloane's fleeting glance at the fireplace, Hollis's tightening of her jaw spoke volumes. As the day wore on, I conducted brief, ostensibly casual interviews. A question here about a missing envelope, a glance there at a reaction, a slight alteration in tone when discussing the estate. Each response fed a lattice of suspicion and opportunity. I began to see faint patterns, tiny alignments of interest and behavior that, when seen collectively, suggested more than coincidence. The missing letter was no accident. The question was who could manipulate the situation without leaving an obvious trace. By evening, Wolfe finally moved, or rather adjusted his posture, signaling the next phase. "All present," he said, voice smooth, but carrying a weight that silenced casual conversation, "will remain for a review of materials. Each of you will recount yesterday's movements regarding the documents. Accuracy is imperative. Falsehoods, unintentional or otherwise, will be noted." It was the first clear command of the investigation from the man himself, and it was enough to focus the room. Even Harrow, who had tried to assert legal authority, fell back, recognizing that Wolfe's dominion in this house was absolute. The stage was set. The players, each with motives and secrets, were aligned within Wolfe's observation radius. And I, as ever, was the chronicler, noting every inflection, pause, and calculated glance, knowing that the first full unraveling of this mystery would emerge not from force but from careful, measured scrutiny. Wolfe's strategy was always the same: observe, calculate, and direct. My part, naturally, was the messy, public-facing legwork, chasing people, listening, poking into alleys of suspicion where Wolfe's chair never reached. The morning after the formal review, I set out with a folder of documents, a list of people to see, and the faint sense that this case, while not a murder, was going to be messier than any I'd anticipated. First on my list was Reginald Carrow. I found him at his office on Park Avenue, surrounded by neat stacks of financial reports and tax ledgers. Carrow's sharp eyes followed me as I entered, calculating the purpose of my visit with the precision of a man used to auditing, motives and numbers simultaneously. "Good morning," I said casually, leaning against a bookshelf as if this were a friendly call rather than a probing interview. "I just wanted to clarify a few things about the Marrowbone papers and your movements yesterday." "It's all part of the review," Wolfe insists on. Caro's thin lips pressed together. "I suppose that's reasonable, but I assure you, Archie, my movements were entirely above board. I spent the better part of the afternoon reviewing account ledgers and correspondence. Any gaps in documentation are administrative errors, nothing more." I noted the slight quiver in his right hand as he adjusted his cuff. Administrative errors have a way of creating stories, don't they? Especially when a letter goes missing. His reaction was subtle, a half flinch, a blink too long. He waved a hand. "I see." "You suspect me?" "Not yet. Just collecting impressions." I let that hang in the air, allowing him to squirm slightly under the scrutiny. The art of interviewing, I'd learned, was often more about reading what was unsaid than the words spoken. Next, I went to Julian Sloane's office, a glass anchrome affair that practically shouted ambition. Sloane was standing by the window when I arrived, reviewing a stack of papers with an intensity that suggested he wanted to see me out before I'd barely begun. "Mr. Sloane," I said, stepping inside, "I'm following up on Wolfe's inquiry. Yesterday's events, what were you doing when the documents were being reviewed?" Sloane's practiced composure didn't falter. I was cross-referencing the estate's legal files, ensuring no irregularities were overlooked. Every step was documented. His smile, tight and controlled, didn't reach his eyes. "You may verify that if you wish." I did wish. And I did verify, noting the meticulous records, but also the tiny inconsistencies. A misdated note here, a pencil mark there, a quick erasure. Not enough to accuse anyone, but enough to feed Wolfe's lattice of observation. By midday, I was shadowing Margaret Hollis, who had agreed to meet me at a nearby cafe under the pretense of discussing document organization. She was precise, deliberate, and intensely private, scanning every passerby as though predicting the intentions of strangers in real time. "I want to be helpful," she said, "but I cannot account for what others might have done. I maintain my own records meticulously, but I do not interfere with their work. You understand?" I nodded, casually observing the subtle ways her hands moved over her notes, the angle of her body as she listened. There was loyalty in her posture, but also a personal stake. I could see it, the way she flinched ever so slightly when the topic of the missing letter came up. "What's the most suspicious thing you've seen recently?" I asked. Her eyes flicked downward, thoughtful, the way some items move or disappear without explanation. "But I am not sure if it is carelessness or intent." That last word, intent, lingered. I made a mental note. Intent was the hinge on which this mystery swung. Finally, I shadowed Eleanor Marrowbone herself, visiting a small archival office near her father's former law firm. She was methodical, but I detected tension in the way she handled correspondence, the almost imperceptible sighs when opening envelopes, and the frequent, almost obsessive checks of what she carried. A missing document, she knew, could unravel not just facts, but carefully constructed narratives, and she feared it might have already done so. By late afternoon, I had enough to return to the brownstone and begin synthesizing impressions. Wolfe greeted me with a look that suggested he had anticipated my observations, yet wanted to hear them all the same. "Report," he said, voice precise. I laid out the day's findings in measured detail, noting inconsistencies, hesitations, and subtle emotional cues. Caro's minor flinch, Sloane's erasure marks, Hollis's tiny flinch toward ownership of information, Eleanor's obsessive checking. All of them are cautious, I summarized. None overtly guilty, but all capable of concealment. And someone moved the letter yesterday. I don't know who yet, but the subtleties line up. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled, precisely why observation, patience, and inference are superior to haste and suspicion. The first removal, planned or opportunistic, establishes patterns. Those patterns expose both the method and the motive. And we watch, I said, smiling faintly, like hawks in a cage, but with paperwork instead of prey. Wolfe gave the smallest nod. And the prey will expose itself if we only watch with intelligence rather than impulse. Leave surveillance to me, Archie. You will continue collecting observations. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitation matters. The city outside churned along, oblivious to our careful operations within the walls of the brownstone. But inside, every movement was significant, every subtle reaction recorded. I felt the familiar thrill in a case like this. Success depended not on action, but on careful, relentless observation and the ability to connect dots no one else even noticed. I knew the next steps would require even greater patience. The suspects, each with a motive and access, were already intertwined in a web they could not see. And as always, Wolfe, from his chair, would see every thread, every hidden tension, and every opportunity to draw truth from deception. The day the subtle trespass revealed itself, I realized that the brownstone had grown accustomed to my footsteps, but was still capable of shocks. It was mid-morning when I first noticed a spice jar's mundane little thing from the kitchen that had been moved from its usual spot on the shelf above Wolfe's desk. Normally I wouldn't have remarked on such trivialities, but Wolfe's eyes, sharp as ever, had already noted the shift. He didn't mention it, of course. He never mentioned trivialities unless they were a thread to something larger. I stared at the displaced jar, frowning. Who would bother to move a spice jar, and more importantly, why? It was such a small, insignificant act that it could have easily gone unnoticed, yet the timing was suspicious. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, noting the faint smudge along its side, the kind that told a story without words. "Archie," Wolfe said without looking up, "do you know the significance of a small disturbance in a controlled environment?" "Yes, sir," I replied cautiously. "It's a signal. Someone was here, or someone meant for someone to think they were." Wolfe inclined his head. "Precisely. Subtle trespass is often more revealing than overt interference. It carries intention without exposure. The question is whose intention and to what end. By mid-afternoon, the implications became clearer. As I followed up on a few errands related to the Marrowbone estate, I received a tip from a street informant who had noticed a familiar figure near the Marrowbone offices, someone moving with a certain caution, glancing repeatedly over the shoulder, handling a small packet of papers with care. I recognized the description immediately of Miranda Cross. Returning to the brownstone, I observed her as she handled documents for Eleanor Marrowbone. She was precise, delicate, almost reverent, yet there was a subtle hesitancy, a microcosm of worry in the way she placed an envelope onto the stack, pulled it back, then placed it again. I noted it meticulously. Someone who feared being caught would betray themselves in the smallest gestures. Harrow, for his part, seemed increasingly nervous. The legal man was usually composed, but the subtle tension in his jawline and the way he kept checking the clock suggested that he understood the balance of power in this house and that he was not in control. Wolfe noticed, too. I could see the faint shift of his eyebrows as he measured Harrow's subtle discomfort, calculating, waiting. Eleanor remained intensely focused on her efforts to organize the documents, but she too betrayed signs of strain. Small sighs, the occasional rubbing of her temples, the way she bit the edge of her glove, all indicators of anxiety. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet tension that fills a room like fog. And then, more compellingly, I noticed a small envelope tucked behind a stack of papers on Wolfe's desk, an envelope that had not been there the previous day. I picked it up with care. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, and it carried the faintest trace of old ink. Wolfe observed my actions without a word, his eyes narrowing imperceptibly, measuring my comprehension of the situation. "It has been moved," he said finally, "or left intentionally. Either way, it is evidence. The content of the envelope is of interest. It may illuminate the subtle interference we have noted." I glanced at him. "You want me to open it?" He gave a small, almost disdainful sigh. "Open it. That is not your function. Catalogue its presence. Observe it. Record its placement and the context of its discovery. These small acts are often the doorway to the larger design." I noted the envelope carefully, then returned to observing the room. Each person present moved with a degree of calculated awareness, as if feeling the invisible gravity Wolfe exerts on all who enter his domain. Even minor disturbances, the movement of a paper, the arrangement of a chair, were magnified under his scrutiny. That evening, as the group prepared to leave the brownstone temporarily, Wolfe called me to his side. "Archie, I want you to follow certain patterns in the behavior of these individuals," he said. "Not overt acts, but subtle ones. Observe hesitations, glances, deviations from normal routines. Those are the moments in which intent becomes visible. You will act as our eyes beyond the confines of this house." I knew exactly what he meant. The brownstone was a controlled environment, a stage set for mental observation, and any disturbance, no matter how minor, was a clue. The moved spice jar, the subtle rearrangement of papers, the hidden envelope, all of it constituted a quiet map that, when read correctly, would point to motives, actions, and ultimately the missing letter. After everyone had departed, I lingered in the quiet of the brownstone, cataloguing every anomaly. Wolfe sat immobile, staring at the wall as if the very pattern of light falling through the windows were a clue. I noted the envelope, the moved jar, the slight creases in the rug near the desk, all small, subtle trespasses, each a brushstroke in a portrait of secrecy. I considered the possibilities of someone testing the boundaries, someone deliberately leaving signals, or perhaps someone simply careless. The thought of carelessness in the context of these precise, meticulous people seemed almost ludicrous. No, these movements carried intention, and intention meant motive, and motive, well, Wolfe would soon untangle that with precision unmatched. I also reflected on the psychological impact of these disturbances. Even minor interference could shift power dynamics. In the brownstone, the smallest act of rearrangement was magnified, becoming both a challenge and a signal. Each participant would respond differently, revealing cracks in composure, loyalty, and restraint. As night fell, I catalogued everything in my notebook, envelopes, jars, glances, hesitations. Each small detail contributed to a lattice of observation that Wolfe would use to reveal the hidden structures of deception. And I knew that the subtle trespass we had observed was only the beginning, a gentle ripple signaling a deeper disturbance that would soon demand action. The brownstone had settled into its usual quiet after the subtle trespass, but it was only the calm before the storm. I could feel the tension coiling in the corners of the room, invisible yet palpable, a slow tightening that only Wolfe could truly read. By mid-morning, that tension escalated in the form of a second incident, one that made the earlier disturbances seem trivial by comparison. It began with a faint, almost imperceptible noise from the rear of the office, a soft click, followed by the whisper of movement over the hardwood floor. I was the first to notice it, though only because I was leaning against the desk, pen in hand, cataloguing the minute details of the envelope found the previous day. I glanced toward Wolfe, who remained impassive, his eyes closed in meditation, yet every muscle in his face suggested he had registered the sound long before I had. Before I could even speak, Eleanor Marrowbone exclaimed, "My documents! My letters!" She had risen from her chair, scanning the work table in panic. The envelope I had catalogued the night before was now missing, along with 2 additional letters I hadn't even noticed. Wolfe's gaze opened, sharp and cold. "Gone," he stated simply, as if pronouncing a fact beyond debate. No hysteria, no dramatics, just a statement of the undeniable. I checked the desk and nearby shelves quickly, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of theft in the conventional sense. This was a precise, deliberate second wave of interference designed to unsettle rather than to attract notice. Harrow, who had been present to observe, stepped forward, his expression tight. "Mr. Wolfe, surely we should call the authorities. These are clearly stolen documents." Wolfe shook his head ever so slightly. "No," he said, "this is not the way we proceed. The method and motive are more important than alarm. If we alert the authorities prematurely, the pattern will vanish, leaving only confusion. We do not seek chaos, we seek clarity." Eleanor's hands trembled as she tried to organize the remaining papers. "But someone is targeting us, targeting my father's legacy." "Exactly," Wolfe said, tone measured. "And that is precisely why observation is paramount. Panic will serve only the perpetrator. We must tighten the focus, identify the patterns, and allow the subtle cues to lead us." At that moment, Wolfe called Saul Panzer. Within the hour, Saul arrived, carrying his usual air of quiet competence. He moved through the brownstone like a shadow, noting every surface, every footprint, every small Animalian extension of Wolfe's will. A man whose intellect and physical vigilance complemented Wolfe's cerebral mastery. "Saul," Wolfe said, "observe the ingress and egress points. Note anyone lingering nearby, anyone showing unusual interest in the building. Report all deviations from normal patterns. Your presence here is required, but only as an extension of observation. Do not confront unless directed." Saul nodded, moving silently toward the windows and entrances, scanning the streets outside as I watched, noting the meticulous way he catalogued potential threats. It was like watching a living diagram of vigilance, every detail recorded, every angle covered, every possibility anticipated. Meanwhile, I began questioning the Marrowbone circle, again gently, unobtrusively, while keeping an eye on reactions. Carrow's fingers drummed nervously on the edge of the desk. Sloane's eyes darted to the rear entrance, as though wondering whether someone might return. Hollis, who had remained the most composed, now betrayed subtle tension, her jaw tight, her posture rigid. And Eleanor, understandably, was nearly trembling, oscillating between determination and despair. The missing documents were small, seemingly insignificant pieces of paper, but their disappearance represented a moral and intellectual threat. Wolfe had explained it once in passing. The value of information is rarely in its immediate content. It is in the leverage it affords, the patterns it reveals, and the secrets it guards. Whoever had taken the letters understood that perfectly. I noted minor contradictions as I questioned each person. Carrow claimed to have remained at his office, yet he couldn't account for a 30-minute gap. Sloane's notes were meticulous, but he fumbled over the timestamp on one of his entries. Hollis's explanation of document handling shifted subtly under repeated questioning. Eleanor, in her anxiety, had begun moving papers in patterns that obscured more than they clarified. All of these were subtle indicators, mere ripples in the controlled environment, yet enough for Wolfe to expand his mental lattice. Each hesitation, each flinch, each minor discrepancy was a thread. The missing envelope was the center of gravity, and everything else revolved around it. By evening, Wolfe had completed a brief session of silent observation, punctuated only by occasional, precise questions that revealed more than interrogation ever could. "Who accessed the desk yesterday at precisely 3:24? He asked, voice smooth but commanding. No embellishments, no assumptions. A tense silence fell. Eyes darted, subtle shifts of weight betrayed unease. Caro's lips tightened, Sloane's gaze flitted toward the window, Hollis's fingers twisted in her lap, and Eleanor's face was pale with anticipation. Wolfe, seated in his chair like an immovable lighthouse, let them squirm quietly, waiting for their impulses to betray them. Finally, Wolfe spoke again. The pattern is emerging. Subtle trespass has escalated to deliberate removal. The actor understands discretion, understands timing, understands psychology, and that, gentlemen and ladies, is why we do not act rashly. Observation first, conclusion second. I scribbled notes furiously, knowing that the next day would demand follow-ups, further surveillance, and probably another layer of human complexity. Saul would patrol, I would continue interviewing, and Wolfe would sit in his chair, orchestrating the entire endeavor without ever leaving the room. The missing documents, the moved spice jar, the vanished letters were more than items. They were symbols of control, power, and intellect. Whoever had interfered understood that, and so did Wolfe. The brownstone, sacred and orderly, had been disturbed, and the repercussions were only beginning to unfold. By the time evening settled over the brownstone, the air had thickened with anticipation. The missing letters and subtle disturbances had transformed the ordinary office into a theatre of psychological manoeuvring. Wolfe, immobile in his chair, exuded the calm authority of a man who saw every detail, every motive, every misstep before it happened. I, meanwhile, moved through the room, silent and observant, recording the small, telling gestures that would feed Wolfe's lattice of inference. The first move in his indirect positioning began with Eleanor Marrowbone. Wolfe called her to the center of the room and asked her, softly yet deliberately, "Did anyone assist you yesterday with the arrangement of the documents?" Her eyes flickered briefly toward the others, and she faltered. Only Miss Hollis. She was helping me organize them according to dates and correspondence. And the others? Wolfe's gaze swept over Caro, Sloane, and Hollis herself, each of them now fully aware that every micro-expression would be catalogued and weighed. They were present, Eleanor admitted, hesitating. But I didn't rely on them. I thought they were only observing. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Observe, yes. But observation can also be intervention if the observer chooses to act. His calm pronouncement carried weight far beyond the words themselves. It was a reminder of hierarchy, of control, and of the invisible power he wielded over this room. I noted Caro's slight shift in posture and the subtle tightening of his fingers against his lap. Sloane's hand twitched near a notebook he had been idly adjusting, and Hollis's eyes briefly darted toward the desk, toward the space where the missing envelope had been found and lost. Each small movement spoke volumes, gestures Wolfe would later integrate into the pattern. It was during this controlled examination that Wolfe made his next subtle maneuver the timing of inquiries. He asked questions in a sequence that forced each person to reveal reactions in isolation. Eleanor responded first, giving her unease and honesty in measured doses. Then Caro, whose defensiveness came almost mechanically, betrayed him more than he realized. Sloane, ever the meticulous lawyer, masked minor tensions but revealed slight inconsistencies in his account. Hollis remained precise, yet even her composure was punctuated by micro-expressions, a raised brow, a flicker of eye movement that hinted at internal calculations. After a few minutes, Wolfe gestured toward me. "Archie, provide a detailed report of yesterday's interviews, observations, and anomalies. Your purpose is not to draw conclusions, but to record behavioral patterns, timing, and intent." I complied, moving from desk to desk, notebook in hand, whispering clarifying questions to each person. "Mr. Caro, You said you didn't touch the letters, but did you notice any changes in their arrangement? Caro's voice was controlled but tight. I may have glanced at them, but only to note completeness. I did not move them. And Mr. Sloane, your notes, any revisions? Minor adjustments, purely clerical, Sloane said. The hesitation in minor was subtle enough that I noted it immediately. Hollis's response was flawless in delivery, but the slight narrowing of her eyes when asked about a particular envelope suggested calculation. And Eleanor's anxious energy was now tempered with cautious precision, aware of Wolfe's scrutiny and the consequences of revealing too much or too little. Wolfe watched, his fingers steepled, observing the interplay of intent, fear, and subtle deceit. Notice how each person responds when faced with partial information, he said. Those responses, minor though they seem, will reveal method, motive, and opportunity. Then came the critical test, the placement of a decoy. Wolfe handed me a single, innocuous envelope and instructed me to place it among the remaining documents in Eleanor's care. Do not interfere with its movement, Archie. Simply observe reactions. Someone may take the bait, unaware of its insignificance, yet revealing an intent. I executed the task carefully, placing the envelope atop a neat stack of letters and returning to my observation post. Within minutes, the subtleties began to appear. Caro's fingers brushed against the envelope briefly, almost unconsciously. Sloane's eyes lingered a moment too long. Hollis glanced at it, then immediately adjusted her own stack, a minor protective act. Eleanor, unaware of its decoy nature, simply noted its presence without action. Patterns, Wolfe murmured, more to himself than to me. Patterns reveal the invisible architecture of human behavior. Observe, record, wait. The tension in the room increased not with drama, but with quiet mental pressure. Each person was subtly aware that their actions or inactions were being measured, interpreted, and stored for a later moment of revelation. Wolfe's positioning was psychological. He had made it clear that control rested not in force, but in timing, awareness, and the calculated placement of opportunities. By late evening, the pattern had begun to emerge more clearly. Minor inconsistencies aligned with small movements and hesitations. It was as though a map of intent and subtle interference had been drawn in the very air of the brownstone, invisible to all except the one man capable of seeing it. I recorded everything meticulously, knowing Wolfe would integrate it into the lattice of deduction that would ultimately unravel the mystery. The missing documents, the subtle rearrangements, the decoy envelope, all of it was part of a greater design. Each participant had revealed the smallest aspects of themselves, unguarded and unknowing, and Wolfe would use those threads to trace the full pattern of interference. As night fell and the city lights outside flickered against the windows, I realized the next stage would involve careful confrontation, not overt, not aggressive, but strategically placed, timed, and precise. The brownstone had been disturbed, the actors had moved, and Wolfe had positioned the pieces in such a way that the truth would emerge, quietly, inevitably, and with intellectual clarity. The following morning, Wolfe summoned the entire circle of suspects to the office, a move that carried the gravity of an unseen gavel striking the air. There was no fanfare, no preamble, just the quiet, unavoidable summons that each person recognized as a sign that the brownstone's quiet observance was about to shift into deliberate confrontation. I watched as Eleanor Marrowbone entered first, her steps purposeful, yet tempered with a trace of apprehension. Caro followed, stiff-backed and wary, Sloane trailing with that mechanical charm he always wore like armor, and Hollis last, calm but attentive. Each of them carried subtle tension in their posture, betraying the knowledge that Wolfe's eyes would not miss the smallest detail. Wolfe remained seated, immobile, a figure of absolute authority in a room that suddenly felt smaller. He gestured for them to take the chairs he indicated, arranging the group almost geometrically, as if every line of sight, every potential escape or diversion was accounted for. "Good morning," he began, voice calm, precise, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "We are here to discuss recent events concerning the Marrowbone estate. Certain documents have been removed, others misplaced, and there has been subtle interference that requires clarification. I do not make assumptions. Each of you will answer questions honestly and without embellishment." The effect was immediate. The room's quiet tension thickened, each occupant acutely aware that every gesture, every hesitation, every glance could betray them. I stood at the back, recording, observing, noting the faintest micro-expressions, the small twitch of Caro's lips, the nervous adjustment of Sloane's cuff, Hollis's calm but calculating gaze, Eleanor's anxious yet determined composure. Wolfe directed his first question to Eleanor. "Miss Marrowbone, yesterday you indicated that only Ms. Hollis assisted you with the documents. Is that still your statement?" "Yes," Eleanor said, firm but not unshaken. "Only Margaret helped me organize them. Everyone else observed but did not touch the papers." "And yet," Wolfe continued, fingers steepled, "certain letters have gone missing. You must understand that observation alone does not prevent interference. Were you aware of any movements or unusual handling?" Eleanor shook her head, hands clasped tightly. "No, I did not. I only noticed after the documents were gone." Wolfe's gaze swept the room. "Mr. Caro, during your time here, you were responsible for reviewing the financial correspondence. Did you note any anomalies or missing items?" Caro's jaw tightened. "I did not remove anything. I noted some discrepancies, but nothing that would suggest deliberate removal." "Discrepancies noted?" Wolfe pressed, calm yet sharp. "And yet the letters have vanished. That is not a coincidence. Do you understand the implications of that?" Caro hesitated slightly before nodding, eyes flicking towards Sloane, whose own fingers tightened around the edge of his notebook. The subtle interaction, unspoken accusation, veiled concern did not escape Wolfe. Wolfe turned to Sloane next. "You maintain detailed notes of the documents. Were any revisions made that you did not document?" "Minor clerical corrections," Sloane admitted with a practiced smoothness. "Nothing that affects content or sequence." "And yet minor," Wolfe said with precision, "can conceal intent when paired with other deviations. Your corrections, Mr. Sloane, were observed to coincide with the timing of document disappearance." "Explain that?" Sloane swallowed. "I do not know what to say beyond what I have recorded. Margaret Hollis's turn came last." Wolfe's gaze, sharp and unwavering, studied her carefully. "Ms. Hollis, your handling of the materials has been meticulous, yet subtle actions, minor shifts, protective gestures have been observed. Explain their necessity." Hollis's voice remained steady, but the smallest flicker of her eyes betrayed awareness of exposure. "I only sought to ensure no further misplacement occurred. The missing letters are regrettable, but any adjustments I made were protective, not deceptive." Wolfe let the words settle in the room, then leaned slightly forward. "Observe the responses of each individual in relation to known movements. Each answer, hesitation, and micro-expression is part of the pattern. The missing documents were not random, nor is the interference arbitrary. Someone understands subtlety, discretion, and timing. That person has acted deliberately. I could see the shifts already beginning." Eleanor's anxiety was tempered by a spark of determination. Caro's composure was cracking under scrutiny. Sloane's smooth veneer was thinning, and Hollis, despite her calm, revealed tension in posture and expression. Wolfe's positioning had created a crucible. The truth would emerge from human behavior, not coercion or confrontation. He continued, directing questions with the precision of a surgeon, each aimed to elicit maximum informational yield while maintaining calm. The room responded in kind tense, attentive, the occupants' reactions now forming a map of motive, opportunity, and subtle deceit. Finally, Wolfe paused, surveying the room like a master painter, stepping back to assess his composition. The lattice of observation is nearly complete. Each of you has revealed more in gestures and hesitations than in words. The next steps will determine who acts from intent, who from impulse, and who from circumstance. Accuracy, honesty, and subtlety are paramount. Any deviation will be noted and factored into conclusions. I recorded every nuance, every silence, and every shift of expression. Wolfe's calm, strategic control had transformed the brownstone into a chamber where truth could not remain hidden. The gathering had achieved its purpose. The stage was set, each participant's patterns laid bare, and the threads of the mystery drawn taut, ready for the final unraveling. The room was hushed, the weight of anticipation pressing down like an invisible hand. Wolfe had called the Marrowbone circle together once more, and the subtle tension was almost tangible. Unlike the previous gatherings, there was no preliminary discussion, no gentle probing. Wolfe had now observed enough, noted enough, and allowed the patterns to solidify in his mind. It was time for the revelation. He began with a calm sweep of the room, eyes flicking from Eleanor Marrowbone to Caro, Sloane, and Hollis. The subtle disturbances, the missing documents, the careful observation and interference, all of it points to a single actor. Not motivated by accident, nor by simple curiosity. The letter, the envelope, the rearrangements, these are not mistakes. They are actions guided by intent. A quiet tension followed, punctuated only by the faint tick of the wall clock. I could see the ripple of unease spreading through the group. Each person knew instinctively that Wolfe had pinpointed the locus of the disruption. "Mr. Caro," Wolfe continued, voice precise, unyielding, "your movements yesterday were not solely professional. The timing of your presence, the glances towards certain stacks of papers, the brief hesitations these were observed, but it was not your sole initiative." Caro's lips pressed together, hands gripping the edge of the chair. "I only checked the documents for completeness." "Indeed," Wolfe replied, "but you were not alone in the interest you displayed. Consider the micro-expressions, the slight protective gestures, the very manner in which papers were handled. Someone assisted, or rather orchestrated, the interference." Eyes shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, toward Margaret Hollis. She maintained composure, yet the faint narrowing of her eyes, the slight shift in posture, betrayed more than words could conceal. Wolfe's gaze fixed on her. "Ms. Hollis, you acted with both care and calculation. You were aware of the missing documents, yet manipulated their placement and subtly directed the attention of others. Your actions were protective in appearance, but guided by foresight and intent." Hollis's voice remained steady. "I only sought to protect the integrity of the materials." "Precisely," Wolfe interrupted. "You sought to protect, but in doing so revealed the pattern of manipulation. You were aware of who might benefit from concealment, who might act in haste, and you moved to guide outcomes without exposure. That is the hallmark of subtle orchestration." Eleanor's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair, a mixture of realization and apprehension passing across her face. Sloane's fingers drummed nervously on his notebook. He had maintained composure until now, but the smallest cracks began to appear. Wolfe turned his gaze to Sloane. "And you, Mr. Sloane, while meticulous in record-keeping, revealed the slightest inconsistency when questioned. Minor clerical corrections, misdated entries, actions intended to conceal observation and timing, these alone would not suffice, but when paired with Miss Hollis's adjustments, the pattern emerges clearly. Sloane's jaw tightened. Those were just clerical errors. Wolfe's lips pressed together. Errors. When they occur precisely at moments of subtle interference, they cannot be called errors. They are indications of involvement, whether deliberate or complicit. Finally, Wolfe's attention shifted back to Eleanor. Miss Marrowbone, your role has been clear, genuine concern for the preservation and understanding of your father's documents. Yet even you, in handling the decoy envelope, revealed tendencies to influence and protect outcomes, instincts natural to your character, but instrumental in clarifying the patterns for observation. The room was still, and even I felt the pressure of the revelation settling in the air. Wolfe's methodical dismantling of the pretense, the subtle orchestration, the hidden motives, it was a display of intellectual precision unmatched by any other presence I'd witnessed. He continued, voice unyielding. The missing letter, the envelope that initiated this investigation, was removed, concealed, and ultimately returned by one individual, Margaret Hollis. Her intent was not theft for personal gain, but strategic manipulation. By controlling the placement and observation of documents, she influenced the behavior of others, revealing their motives, priorities, and loyalties. Her orchestration allowed us to see who acted from impulse, who from self-interest, and who from circumstance. Hollis's face remained composed, but the slightest flicker in her eyes betrayed acknowledgement. Caro's expression shifted from confusion to reluctant understanding. Sloane's fingers tightened into a fist, realizing the intellectual trap Wolfe had set without lifting more than an eyebrow. Eleanor's face, though tense, softened with relief. Wolfe's gaze swept the room once more, capturing every detail. No documents were permanently removed, no information was lost. The missing letter was a tester demonstration of subtlety, observation, and the consequences of human action under controlled conditions. Every participant has been assessed, every pattern observed, and the truth, now revealed, stands unambiguous. I stepped forward, presenting the recovered envelope, the tangible proof of Wolfe's deduction. Hollis took a measured breath, then nodded slightly, acknowledging both the correctness and inevitability of the revelation. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled once more, as if concluding the lesson in a classroom. Intellect, observation, and patience are the instruments of justice in situations devoid of overt crime. The subtle trespass, the removed letter, the behavioral cues all have illustrated the interplay of intention and consequence. Human behavior, even in minor acts, cannot escape careful scrutiny. Eleanor exhaled slowly, relief washing over her features. I understand. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Hollis gave a small, restrained nod, and even Caro relaxed slightly, as if relieved that the intellectual reckoning, rather than legal or physical confrontation, had resolved the matter. Sloane, although stiff, maintained professional composure, acknowledging the brilliance of the strategy even as it undermined his carefully maintained facade. I watched, noting each reaction, the subtle unmasking of truth in a room that had become a stage for human behavior. Wolfe's calm precision had not only uncovered the orchestrator, but also revealed the nuances of intent, the hierarchy of motives, and the consequences of subtle action. The reveal was complete. Not with dramatic flourish, not with confrontation or alarm, but with quiet, intellectual justice, delivered with the precision only Nero Wolfe could command. The brownstone had quieted again, but the stillness was different this time, charged with the satisfaction of resolution, the soft hum of restored order. The subtle disturbances, the missing letters, and the careful orchestration had all been accounted for, and the intellectual justice that only Wolfe could deliver had been served. The air smelled faintly of old paper, coffee, and a tension finally released, like the slow exhale of a room that had held its breath too long. Wolfe remained in his chair, a monument of calm authority, surveying the room as if confirming that the world had returned to its proper alignment. He had already dismissed the Marrowbone circle, each participant now departing with a combination of relief, respect, and lingering apprehension, aware perhaps for the first time of the power that resides in quiet observation and precise intellect. I lingered behind, cataloguing the final impressions for Wolfe, who had already begun to sip a fresh cup of coffee, his posture perfectly composed, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point beyond the window. "Archie," he said finally, without lifting his eyes, "the matter is concluded. Every thread of human behavior has been observed, every intention accounted for. Justice has been served not by force, but by intellect, timing, and subtle orchestration. Note that these elements are far more instructive than any physical evidence or testimony." "Yes, sir," I said, closing my notebook with a quiet snap. "And it all hinges on observation. Small gestures, tiny hesitations, subtle rearrangements, those were the keys." "Precisely," Wolfe replied. "It is the ordinary, the subtle, the nearly imperceptible that often reveals the extraordinary." The missing letters were but a catalyst, a demonstration of the patterns of intent and consequence. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled into a chair opposite him, letting the weight of the day's events settle. The thrill of the intellectual chase lingered, but unlike most investigations, this one carried no blood, no violence, only the revelation of hidden motives and the disciplined extraction of truth. The Marrowbone documents were restored to Eleanor, who had returned briefly to collect them under the watchful eyes of Wolfe and me. Her gratitude was quiet, sincere, and tempered by the understanding that her father's legacy and her own future dealings had been preserved through method, patience, and the careful alignment of human observation. Margaret Hollis departed with her professional composure intact, yet even she could not fully mask the acknowledgement of Wolfe's brilliance. Caro and Sloane had left, their respect for the process tempered by a quiet realization that intellect, not force, had determined the outcome. I lingered by the desk, picking up the decoy envelope Wolfe had used in his subtle positioning, noting the elegance of the trap and the precision with which it revealed the orchestrator. The room, the documents, the arrangement, all of it was now a tableau of human behavior and intellectual clarity, frozen in the aftermath of revelation. Wolfe's gaze finally settled on me. "Archie, note the moral as well as the intellectual lesson. Subtlety is more powerful than force. Patience surpasses haste. The human mind, when guided by intellect rather than impulse, will reveal its secrets in due time. And the diligent observer, with eyes attuned to the nuances of behavior, will discern truth without confrontation." I nodded, making a mental note for my report to the reader, or, more accurately, my narration, and I suppose it helps that the observer also has a chair that everyone respects, right? I added a hint of humor in my tone. Wolfe didn't glance at me. The chair is irrelevant. Authority resides in intellect, discipline, and the understanding of human nature. The chair merely provides vantage, not power. Remember that, Archie. I sipped my coffee, letting the moment settle. The city outside was indifferent, as always, its ceaseless motion contrasting with the calm triumph within the brownstone. The streets, the noise, the chaos, they had no bearing on what had just transpired. Here, in the controlled environment of observation, subtlety had triumphed, and truth had been extracted without a single, overt confrontation. Finally, I allowed myself a small quip. Well, Nero, I have to admit, no one got shot, no one got arrested, and yet you managed to make them squirm more than a dozen men with rifles ever could." Wolfe's lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile. "Squirming is of no consequence. The mind's exposure is the true measure of revelation." I leaned back, glancing at the neat stacks of documents, the faint traces of rearrangement, and the envelope that had served as both lure and proof. It had been a quiet war of intellect, one fought in subtle movements, thoughtful hesitation, and unspoken strategies. And it had been won flawlessly. The brownstone returned to its usual atmosphere of calm authority, but now with the added resonance of accomplishment. Wolfe would resume his meals, his orchids would receive care, and the scent of coffee would once again dominate the space, unaccompanied by the tension of observation and hidden manipulation. I knew, though, that the lesson lingered not only for those who had visited the brownstone, but for anyone who underestimated the power of subtlety, patience, and intellect. The missing letters, the minor disturbances, and the precise orchestration of human behavior had all underscored one immutable truth in matters of human motivation. Subtlety often speaks louder than action, and observation wields more influence than confrontation. As I prepared to leave the office, Wolfe sipped his coffee and murmured, "Justice is intellectual, Archie. When exercised correctly, it requires no blood, no weapon, and no coercion, only clarity of mind and integrity of observation. Remember that." I smiled faintly, turning toward the door. "Got it, Nero. Mental domination, subtle traps, human foibles. Sounds like a good day at the office." He did not reply, of course, and I knew better than to expect it. Wolfe had concluded the case, restored order, and reinforced the invisible hierarchy of intellect in the brownstone. And me? I had the satisfaction of chronicling the process, observing the human drama unfold, and recording, in my own words, the quiet triumph of subtle genius.